Today we're going to talk about the historical perspective on land governance, especially in the Indian context. So, while India's land governance trajectory may seem to many like global histories around the world, especially in the global south, where the land relations go from the communal to the feudal to the colonial and finally to the individual. However, it bears unique characteristics of its own social systems, which have survived and evolved across eras of conquests, instability, consolidation, and decentralization. The lack of a seminal piece of legislation like the Magna Carta in England meant that the right of free citizens to own and inherit property was never fully recognized under the law. However, did the lack of an overarching legislation surrounding land relations for much of its history mean Indian state lacked capacity to govern its citizens' land relations? Let's find out. So, from the early Vedic times, India had a mixture of land relations based on its stratified social structure. The earliest nature of land relations could be mainly divided into private ownership, royal administration, and communal rule. Private ownership was limited in the early period in its absoluteness and scope, applicable mainly to the ruling clans. For communities at the lower end of the social strata, the village evolved as a self sufficient unit of society. All land belonged to the village, with individuals having the right to occupy and cultivate land. Although overlordship of these private lands belonged to the ruling clan, they exercised minimal influence in practice and only claimed part of the produce of the land. Most of these relations were customary in nature, with no formal decree available establishing clear delineation of the types of ownership and or possession. By the time of the Maurya and Gupta empires, tax revenue from agriculture had become a well established source of income for the early state, and mechanisms to ensure its timely payment started to emerge. Whereas earlier, the clansmen from the community voluntarily provided wealth to the ruling clan, now wealth was being extracted by a group who was not associated with the community through kinship ties. Bimbisara established the first imperial land administration system. Officers were appointed to measure the land under cultivation and evaluate the crop. Ashoka's inscription at Lumbini also mentions the Bali and the Bhaga. Bali is thought to have been the tax on the amount of land cultivated, while Bhaga was the share of the produce. Another trend that gained strength during this time was that more and more land was being claimed by the state, with it being eventually considered that the state had right to all wasteland, which included forests and wilderness. The text of the Arthashastra advocates that the state should organize the clearing of new areas of deserted lands and settle large number of Shudra cultivators, thereby showing how control over land fueled the socio-political ambitions of a growing empire. With the consolidation of land administration with the state, we also start seeing the donation or dana of land by rulers to grantees, particularly religious grantees like priests and temples. Agrahara was the practice of granting of rent-free land to the temple, while Brahmadeya was when a village could be made a collectivity of a Brahmins. This led to landlordism among such grantees and eventually among their descendants. With the entry of Muslim rulers, we see a consolidation of such quasi-proprietary rights over land within an even smaller group of grantees. As these rulers came from outside India, they preferred building a strong system of self-appointed intermediaries from their military ranks who were awarded plots of land or jagirs in return of sharing taxes with the sovereign. These jagirs, although not meant to be hereditary or transferable, became so over the course of multiple rulers as these intermediaries became powerful jagirdars. Revenue assessment during this time, however, was much more comprehensive than in the past, with some rulers like Sher Shah Suri issuing documents like pattas or title deeds to the peasants, specifying the revenue which they had to pay, and the kabuliyat, a written document that the peasants signed to agree to pay rent on the land. This kabuliyat also mentioned the rights and liabilities of the tenant. However, these systems were not standardized across the country due to the existence of multiple empires across different regions. Even during this time, there was a general recognition of the peasants' title to hereditary and permanent occupancy. The inviolability of occupancy rights of the peasants is recognized in multiple decrees during the reigns of Akbar and Jahangir, which prohibit the revenue officials from forcibly converting the peasants' land into their own holdings. This did not, however, translate into the recognition of land alienation or the ability of cultivators to dispose of the land as per their own choosing, as coercion and threats of corporal punishment were often prescribed to those occupiers who refused to cultivate land. As Professor Irfan Habib aptly says in his book, in one sense, the land belonged to the peasant, in another, the peasant belonged to the land. The codependent relationship between the land and the occupiers received legal mandate with the beginning of the British colonialism. The Zamindars and the Jagirdars, who had emerged under the Mughal and Islamic sultanates, became indispensable for administrating the huge and complex system of land relations inherited by the early British colonialists. To do away with the multitude of claims upon land by numerous people at various levels of hierarchies, the company decided to auction off land leases to the privileged classes who could afford it, with the condition being that the revenue, which was primarily fixed during the auction in a speculative way, that revenue had to be paid to the company. Through legislations like the permanent settlement, the intermediaries became de facto owners while cultivators became tenants. However, the speculative system of assessing land revenue via auctions and the subsequent inflated tax expectations started disposing both the cultivators and the zamindars. Because of this, the British started experimenting with more decentralized forms of land governance in other areas, resulting in hybrid systems like the Mallarwari in North India, where effective ownership of most land was vested with the cultivators, but the revenue was rendered commonly by the village, and Rayatwari in the Deccan, where tax is directly collected by the state from peasant proprietors. Most of these land governance systems had already existed before the advent of the colonial state, in one form or another. However, the British colonial administrators introduced Western style surveys and dispute resolution systems like civil courts, which provided a newly legitimized alternative to communally self governing bodies like panchayats, thereby enabling collateralization of land as an asset and the emergence of a class of moneylenders and financial institutions. However, after becoming wary of the constant peasant revolts due to debt related displacement, the colonial state acquiesced to putting back some of the restrictions on land transfers, particularly to non agriculturalists, and the seizure of mortgaged property by moneylenders. But the colonial state's most long lasting impact on land administration came in the domain of forest governance with the formation of the Imperial Forest Department in 1864 and the passing of the Forests Act in 1878 and 1927. These acts emphasized the scientific management and categorization of forests and established that the customary use of forest by the indigenous communities was based not on right but on privilege exercised at the mercy of the state. The categorization of forests as reserved and protected made actions such as hunting, fishing, fish collection, wood cutting illegal and subject to intense state scrutiny. The independence movement in the 1900s capitalized on such rural distress in many parts of the country and advocated for a change in what they termed as archaic landlord-tenant relations. Thus, resistance to such taxation became one of the cornerstones of political resistance against British colonialism, especially in rural areas, as is exemplified in the multiple satyagrahas, non-cooperation movement, and Quit India movements. Post-independence, the socialistically inclined Indian state focused its attention on immediate reform efforts. A high-power committee was set up in 1948 under the chairmanship of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. The committee recommended, firstly, the elimination of all intermediaries like the zamindars or jagirdars. Secondly, that land should be held as a source of employment. Therefore, land belonging to non-cultivating owners should be taken over by the government. And thirdly, that the maximum and minimum size of land holding should be fixed so that land consolidation doesn't happen in the hands of a few privileged people. However, the vastness of the policy objectives, coupled with the limited capacity of the newly independent state to monitor and regulate its implementation, meant that even by the 1990s, the policy had made marginal progress across most of its objectives. By the 1990s, we see a marked change in the state's relationship with land and its occupiers. The state assumed the role of facilitator rather than as an interventionist. The era saw the passing of several acts like PESA, which required Gram Sabha to approve any transfers of land in scheduled areas, the right to fair compensation and transparency in land acquisition, which for the first time that the state recognized that any kind of development initiative must be carefully weighed against the associated social costs. The Forest Right Act was also passed during this time, which recognized the historical injustice towards tribal communities with respect to ownership and attempted to correct it via individual and community forest rights. And finally, the amendment to the Hindu Succession Act, along with several gender based policies like joint titling in land records, subsidies for women in property registration and purchase, were passed. Through these efforts, it sought to balance the overall need for easier market access to land with the upliftment of marginalized communities. At the same time, there was a renewed focus on conclusive titling using modern technologies, leading to the digitization of land records program or NLRMP in 1995, which later became the DILRMP in 2016. The impetus for this new focus was based on Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto's argument that the lack of formal property titles and property rights is the primary reason why capitalism fails in developing countries. Thus, we can see that during much of its history in India, it did not have a seminal piece of legislation like the Magna Carta in England, which mentioned the right of free citizens to own and inherit property. However, the lack of such overarching legislation surrounding land relations did not mean that the Indian state lacked a capacity to govern its citizens' land relations. Land relations in the Indian context show a remarkable continuum in its mode of governance, trying to balance the socio-political demands of its era against the economic expectations of an ever-growing state machinery. Thank you.